Okay, so let's take a look at how we work with fabrics, some of the terminology of fabric, and how we place our patterns onto fabric. When you purchase fabric, either off of a bolt or a roll, you're going to find usually you'll have one edge here that's cut. You'll find it cut by a pair of scissors, usually by the associate who is preparing the fabric for you. This has a torn edge because that's how I have finished off my particular piece of muslin here. But usually this will be cut or torn. And then you'll see a really smooth finished edge here. Let me zoom in for you here. You should find one edge. It's got a very smooth, very clean finish, no fraying. You should be able to glide your finger along the edge. It shouldn't fray or anything. You'll also find that the weave of the fabric along this edge is tighter, denser. It doesn't fray. It may be a slightly different color or slightly different texture than the rest of the fabric. And with this edge over to my left on my work table, if I follow this torn edge, in your case it may be a cut edge, whether it's torn or cut, I'm just going to smooth the fabric all the way over, following it along, following it along. On the other side, I'm going to find another smooth finished edge. Again, no fraying along this edge. It has a slightly different color to it because it's a denser weave. So you can kind of see the paper on my work surface a little bit through this side, but over here it's almost completely opaque, much tighter, denser weave to the fabric here. So when you buy your fabric on a roll or a bolt, you will find two clean edges on either side of that bolt. And these are my clean edges. Here's one clean edge here. It runs the entire length of my cut of fabric. And then all the way over here is the other clean edge. So I have two clean edges on either side, on the right side here and the left side here of my fabric. Now this is very wide fabric. It's 44 inches wide. And this is several yards of fabric, but it's the same with any fabric that you buy. Let's take a look at this fabric here. My printed fabric, my bandana printed fabric. Again, here is the cut edge along the top here. Let me zoom in there for you. You can see along this top edge, there's fraying that's going on. It's not an even cut. It's not smooth. There's a lot of loose threads that are coming loose. I could probably pick these threads out if I wanted to. But if I go all the way over to the left-hand side of my fabric, you'll see right here, nice, smooth, clean, finished edge. No fraying or anything there. And you might notice a slightly different colored line here. This is just part of the manufacturing process for this particular fabric. If I flip it over, you might see some of the ink doesn't quite bleed all the way through here because, again, the fabric is a little bit more dense here. So when they went to print this design on top of this fabric, it may not have bled all the way through. So again, slightly different texture, slightly different weave, different color on the underside of the fabric. And you can see a nice clean line of delineation along this left-hand side of my fabric. And then if I follow my cut edge all the way to the right side of this fabric, I have to go a little bit further over here. I've cut out a corner here. So this is actually a cut edge here. Let me zoom out here. So that's my cut edge here. I chopped out a corner here. So I have to keep going until I get to this edge here. Again, you'll see that line of demarcation along this edge. Right here. See a slightly different line there. And again, if I turn this over, you'll see that the ink did not quite take as well right along that edge. So this is the clean edge of my fabric. And again, just like with my muslin that I just showed, I have a clean edge on the left-hand side and a clean edge on the right-hand side. So anytime you're purchasing fabric, you'll have two clean edges, and those will be your selvage edges. Here's one more piece of fabric, which has a much more noticeable selvage to it. It's very wide fabric. But you can see one edge is very, very frayed. This weave likes to fray, this particular fabric likes to fray. And over here is my nice clean selvage edge. It has a slightly different weave to it, has a different thread going through the very edge of it, so I can clearly see where my selvage starts and where it ends, and then where the rest of my fabric continues. And then if I follow this frayed edge all the way over, I will find another selvage edge over on the right hand side, again with another marked line in the weave to denote where my selvage begins and where it ends and the rest of my fabric starts. So let's take a look at this piece of muslin again. Once we've established where the selvage edges are, and I know I have another one on the other side of my fabric, the other edge of my fabric, we can learn a little bit about the fabric itself. All of the fibers running parallel to the selvage edge make up my grain line. That makes up the grain of my fabric. The grains of the fabric, this direction of the fabric, is the strongest of the fibers in this fabric, and it will usually lay vertically on the body. Again, this is the direction of the grain line. It's always parallel to the selvage edge of the fabric. It is some of the strongest fibers of the fabric, and it will usually lay vertically on the body. All of the fibers going perpendicular to the selvage edge is called the cross grain, because it crosses the grains. Fibers along the cross grain may or may not be as strong as those of the grain. In certain fabrics, you may find the cross grain very stretchy, because this usually lays horizontally around the body, giving a little bit more stretch when wrapping around the human form. So we've essentially created a 90-degree angle here with the grain line and the cross grain. Any angle in between these 90 degrees, going in this direction, anything in between this 90-degree angle is considered the bias. And that could exist here, 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 anywhere encompassing the entire piece of fabric. So any direction on the fabric that is not in line with the grain or the cross grain is considered the bias. Now, assuming this is a proper 90-degree angle, which it isn't because I'm not using my protractor, 45 degrees on this angle, assuming we have a 45-degree angle, is called true bias. True bias exists at a 45-degree angle between the grains and the cross grains of your fabric. So what does this tell us about our fabric? What do we need to know about this? When working with these kinds of fabrics, which are woven fabrics, your grain should have very little to no stretch. You shouldn't be able to stretch it very much. Same thing goes for the cross grain. It should have very little to no stretch. But the bias should have an ample amount of stretch to it, a lot of give. And that exists on just about any point on the bias. I'm stretching this at an angle. It's no longer vertical or horizontal, but it's not on true bias either. It's not a 45-degree angle, but I still have a good deal of stretch in the fabric. The most stretch will exist on true bias, however, at that 45-degree angle. So why do we need to know that when we're working with fabric? As I mentioned before, the grain line typically lies vertically on the body, whereas the cross grain typically lies horizontally on the body. The reason for this is unless we want a garment that's going to stretch and droop down the body, we don't want to drape it or cut it or pattern it, assemble it anywhere on the bias. If we start cutting our fabric in the wrong direction, according to our pattern, we could end up with seams stretching, we could end up with our garment stretching out of shape, and we could end up with warping going on, and we won't really know what's going on. Why are my seams looking so puckered? Why is this garment so much larger than I imagined? More than likely, it's because it wasn't properly cut on grain. You'll notice on most patterns, including those of the sample book, they will have a grain line marked on them, usually denoted by a straight line, sometimes a line with arrowheads. Sometimes it's marked on another vertical or horizontal line on that particular pattern. This tells us which direction we need to place our pattern. If I know my grain line should be parallel to my selvage edge, I can place my pattern in the correct orientation. If I place this pattern this way, suddenly my grain line on the pattern does not match the grain of my fabric. I'm suddenly cutting this on cross grain, or what we refer to as cutting on cross. If I decide I'm going to do this, now I'm suddenly cutting my pattern on bias. And if, in some cases, you're working on a bias cut garment, you might want that. You'll find some samples later on in the quarter where we want to cut on bias. But for the time being, I want to make sure my grain line lines up with the grain of my fabric. So how do I do that? If I place my pattern here, I can't see where I marked my grain line. And obviously you wouldn't be marking all over your fabric when you're actually working on a garment. But we have another line to help us determine where this should go. We have the selvage edge. So I'm going to grab a ruler and I'm going to measure from my grain line on my pattern to my selvage edge. It's approximately 5 inches. I can see on my ruler, it's sitting around the 5-inch mark. And I can place a pattern weight or I can place a pin on my work. I'm going to grab a pattern weight and just kind of weigh that down so my pattern doesn't shift around and my fabric doesn't shift around. And then I'll go to the other edge. I just measured from this top edge of my grain line. Now on larger patterns, you may have a longer grain line to work with. So from this edge to my selvage edge, about 5 inches. I'm going to move my ruler down to the bottom edge, somewhere near the bottom of my grain line. I'm going to check my measurement again. I'm about 1/8 of an inch off over here. I'm down at 4 7/8 of an inch. So I either need to tug my fabric into place. More than likely, I'm just going to tilt my pattern. And there we go. That's a little bit better. That's closer to 5 inches. I'll check one more time up here. That's looking close to 5 inches. We would be good to go. At this point, I can pin this pattern into place, remove my weight, and go ahead and cut through the pattern and the fabric all at once. That's how we align our patterns to our fabric. We utilize the selvage edge to help us position this. Now let's assume we're working over here. Maybe we don't have a selvage edge, or we've cut it off, or something has happened. If you ever cut your selvage edge off, always put a mark on the edge of your fabric so you know which direction your grain line is going if for some reason you lose the selvage edge. But you should have a nice smooth edge there. Now let's say we're creating multiple pattern pieces. Here's a good example. Let's say we're making multiple pattern pieces and we're pinning multiple pieces to the fabric, and we're working somewhere over here. Let's take a look at the zipper patterns way, way, way over here. Now, my ruler's not long enough to measure from the selvage edge. Now, there are some rulers in the classrooms that are large enough, but I know that this is aligned properly. So I can now use this grain line to help me measure this one. Let me grab a larger ruler. And now I can use this as my new grain line so I can establish that this is in the correct position. I also know that the edges of the paper are straight because I haven't cut anything away, but assuming you haven't cut anything, assuming you still have these pieces intact, we want to make sure we can measure this properly. So from this grain line, the bottom of this grain line to this one is about 12.5 inches. And if I scoot up here, just trying to keep my pattern as flat as possible, don't want it to shift on me. There we go, about 12.5 inches. This might need to scoot just a smidge. Nope, scoot it back. There we go. 12.5 inches from this point to this point, and again about 12.5 inches from there to there. So now I know this piece is properly aligned. I couldn't measure all the way over here. I probably could with my particular ruler, but let's say you're working with a very wide piece of fabric and you can't measure all the way to the selvage. Utilize what you've already established to help you position some of your other pattern pieces. This is a good opportunity to showcase some of the patterns that are included in our sample book that have the grain line that's no longer vertical. This is where you get bias cut pieces, and there are a few for our particular sample books, but the process is exactly the same. This is where the grain line is. It's no longer sitting up and down vertically on the page, but now it's sitting like this. So we go and line this up to the selvage edge as best as possible. Sometimes I will use my ruler to my advantage. Because it's clear, I will line up one of the lines in my ruler along the edge and then look to see if my grain line actually matches that. This is probably going to be pretty close. So it's about 5.5 inches there. And there we go, 5.5 inches there. So that one is good to go. Now we're cutting the grain line, right? But our pattern piece has to get shifted 45-degree angles when we go to place it onto our garment. So now suddenly, even though we're cutting this piece like this, we're actually cutting this pattern piece on bias. This is cut on true bias. And there are a few pattern pieces like this in your sample book. So pay close attention to where your grain line is. So when you have your pattern pieces laid out on your fabric, they are all going in the same direction, even if you have pieces like this that are cut on bias. This is also a good opportunity to show you pieces like this that have no grain line established on them. This is a piece that needs to be cut from interfacing. And as long as you're using a weft interfacing and you're not using a stretchy tricot interfacing, as I mentioned in my previous video, it really doesn't matter which direction you cut this. Ideally, you want your grain line to go vertically, but it's a square, so it will work in either direction. So I wasn't as particular for these interfacing pieces, and most of the time you won't need to worry about which direction your interfacing is cut on. Most of your interfacing will not have stretch or give to it. There are instances where you will need to cut your interfacing in a specific direction, but in order to help you all save space on some of your fabric, I'm not requiring you to set this up on the grain line of your interfacing. So keep this in mind when you go to lay your patterns out, because we have a lot of them for our sample books. You're going to need to make sure you're aligning your grain lines properly, keeping the grain line on the pattern parallel to your selvage edge. And this applies for any kind of fabric you're using, be it muslin, printed cotton, or anything else.